In the annals of American criminal history, there exist cases so disturbing, so profoundly troubling, that they challenge our fundamental understanding of human nature itself. The 1870s witnessed one such case in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, a case that would forever alter how society viewed childhood, criminality, and the very nature of evil. The nickname, the Massachusetts Torturer, might conjure images of a menacing figure, perhaps a bearded man with scarred features and a hardened countenance. But the reality proved far more unsettling than any such imagining. The perpetrator behind this moniker was not a fully grown adult, nor even a young man entering his 20s. He was, in fact, merely 12 years old when his reign of terror began. While children his age occupied themselves with laughter, games, and the innocent pursuits of youth, this individual engaged in actions that resulted not in joy, but in screams, not in play, but in bloodshed, not in life, but in death. The case of Jesse Harding Pomeroy remains, to this very day, one of the most extensively studied examples in the fields of psychology, criminology, and forensic psychiatry. It stands as one of the most infamous instances in which the perpetrator of such heinous crimes was barely more than a child himself. Professionals continue to examine this case, searching for answers to questions that have haunted us for more than a century and a half. This documentary draws upon the comprehensive research presented in Don Keetley's book, Making a Monster, Jesse Pomeroy, the boy murderer of 1870s Boston, along with extensive historical records, court documents, and contemporary accounts from that dark period in Boston's history. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Farhan, and you are welcome to another episode of The Lost Docket. Today we journey back to the 19th century to explore one of the darkest and most troubling true crime stories of that era, a story that continues to disturb, fascinate, and horrify us more than 150 years after the events transpired. On the 29th day of November in the year 1859, in the modest working-class town of Charlestown, Massachusetts, a child was born who would eventually be remembered not for any achievement or contribution to society, but for the darkness he would bring into the world. Jesse Harding Pomeroy entered this life as the second child born to Ruth Ann Pomeroy and Thomas Pomeroy, joining his older brother Charles. From the very beginning, Jesse's existence was marked by adversity. Within the first weeks and months of his life, he suffered from a mysterious and severe illness, an affliction that would leave permanent marks upon him, both physically and, perhaps, psychologically. While the exact nature of this childhood malady remains unclear to historians, its effects were unmistakable and lasting. The illness, combined with a congenital condition present from birth, left Jesse with a severely deformed right eye. His pupil and iris failed to develop properly, remaining covered by a thick, whitish membrane that gave his eye a clouded, almost ghostly appearance. This distinctive feature, what some would later describe as resembling a marble or a dead eye, would become Jesse's most identifying characteristic, setting him apart from other children in a way that invited ridicule, isolation, and cruelty from his peers. Jesse's mother, Ruth Ann, later claimed that when Jesse was only a few weeks old, she took him to receive a smallpox vaccination, a common and necessary precaution during an era when waves of smallpox epidemics regularly swept through Boston and its surrounding communities. According to Ruth Ann's account, this vaccination proved catastrophic for her infant son, leaving his small body covered with weeping, infected sores that persisted for months. Whether this vaccination truly caused lasting damage, or whether Ruth Ann sought to find external explanations for her son's later behavior, remains a matter of historical debate. Despite his physical challenges, young Jesse demonstrated considerable intelligence. He possessed a sharp mind and displayed an aptitude for learning that impressed his teachers. However, this intellectual capability did little to ease his social struggles. His unusually tall stature for his age, combined with his distinctive eye condition, made him a target for relentless bullying and social exclusion. The other children viewed him as different, as strange, as somehow less than themselves. Adding to Jesse's difficulties were the epileptic episodes he experienced throughout his childhood. These seizures, unpredictable and frightening, further isolated him from his peers and added another layer of complexity to his already troubled existence. In an era when epilepsy was poorly understood and often viewed with superstition, this condition only intensified the stigma Jesse faced. The Pomeroy household itself provided little refuge from the hardships of the outside world. Jesse's father, Thomas Pomeroy, worked as a butcher and was a veteran of the Civil War. However, whatever discipline and honor he may have demonstrated during his military service did not translate into his family life. Thomas was known throughout the community as a severe alcoholic, a man whose drinking problem fueled increasingly aggressive and violent behavior toward his wife and children. The violence within the Pomeroy home was not merely verbal or emotional, it was brutally physical. When Jesse misbehaved or displeased his father in any way, the punishment was swift and merciless. Thomas would drag his young son to the bathroom, strip him completely naked, and beat him with such ferocity that blood would run down Jesse's small body, pooling on the floor beneath him. These weren't disciplinary spankings or even harsh punishments. They were savage beatings that left lasting physical scars. But Jesse was not the only victim of Thomas Pomeroy's rage. Ruth Ann and Charles also endured regular assaults. Thomas would fly into violent rages, attacking his wife with his fists and subjecting both of his sons to torments that went beyond mere punishment. On multiple occasions, Thomas attempted to drown his children in icy bathwater, holding their heads beneath the freezing water while they struggled and gasped for air. The terror of these near-drowning experiences, the burning sensation in their lungs, the panic, the absolute helplessness, left psychological wounds that may have run even deeper than the physical ones. Much of Jesse's free time was spent in solitary pursuits, as few children wished to associate with the tall, strange boy with the eerie eye. He devoted countless hours to reading sensational novels and stories, particularly tales of frontier violence and indigenous wars. These dime novels, popular entertainment of the era, contained graphic descriptions of torture, scalping, and other brutal acts. Young Jesse absorbed these stories with an intensity that concerned those who knew him, learning methods of punishment and cruelty that most children would have found too disturbing to contemplate. When Jesse did manage to engage with other children in play, his preferences revealed troubling tendencies. He favored games such as Scouts and Indians, but his approach to these games differed markedly from that of other children. While most boys played these games with imagination and make-believe, Jesse seemed driven to reenact the violent scenes he had read about with a realism that disturbed the other children. He would insist on tying up the captives and subjecting them to mock tortures that were far too realistic for comfort. Before Jesse Pomeroy even reached his 10th birthday, warning signs began to emerge, signs that should have alarmed those around him had anyone been paying sufficient attention. These were not the typical mischievous behaviors of a spirited child, but rather indicators of something far more sinister developing within the boy's psyche. Jesse's mother, Ruth Ann, kept several birds as pets, small harmless creatures that brought her moments of joy in an otherwise difficult life. But Jesse developed a disturbing fascination with these birds, a fascination that quickly turned deadly. He would catch the birds when his mother wasn't watching, holding them in his hands as they struggled and chirped in distress. Then, with methodical deliberation, he would tear their heads from their small bodies, watching as their wings continued to flutter even after death had claimed them. When Ruth Ann discovered what her son was doing, she was horrified. She strictly forbade him from going near her birds again, but the damage had been done, both to the innocent creatures and to whatever remained of normalcy in Jesse's developing mind. But the killing did not stop with the birds. A neighbor's cat became Jesse's next victim. The boy obtained a knife and, finding the cat alone, proceeded to torture the animal with a deliberate, methodical cruelty. When the neighbor discovered what had happened to their pet, they reported the incident to Ruth Ann. From that point forward, Jesse was absolutely forbidden from having any pets of his own or from being near any animals without supervision. The community began to whisper about the strange Pomeroy boy and his disturbing behavior toward animals. Eventually, seeking a fresh start and hoping that a change of scenery might somehow alter Jesse's trajectory, the Pomeroy family relocated to Chelsea, a community situated north of Boston. It was a decision that Ruth Ann hoped would benefit her troubled son. Instead, Chelsea would become the site where Jesse's darkest impulses would finally break free from whatever restraints had previously held them in check. In August of 1871, when Jesse was approaching his 12th birthday, the Pomeroy family underwent another significant upheaval. Thomas and Ruth Ann separated, with Thomas leaving the family home. Although Ruth Ann delayed seeking a formal divorce for several years, divorce being a scandalous and difficult process in that era, she eventually cited Thomas's alcoholism as grounds for ending their marriage. The court, applying the standards and prejudices of the time, rejected her petition. Despite evidence suggesting that they had not lived together since 1871, Ruth Ann remained legally married to Thomas until his death in 1898, more than a quarter century after their separation. Shortly after turning 12 years old, Jesse began attacking younger boys. These weren't schoolyard fights or typical childhood scuffles. They were calculated, cruel assaults on children much smaller and weaker than himself. At first, concerned citizens and local authorities regarded Jesse as little more than a troublesome delinquent, a boy who needed discipline and guidance. That perception would soon change dramatically as the true nature of Jesse's activities became clear. On the 22nd of December, 1871, two men walking near an area known as Powderhorn Hill in Chelsea heard something that made them stop in their tracks. It was a sound barely audible, a faint, weak groaning coming from an old, dilapidated shack that most people avoided. Curious and concerned, the men investigated the source of the noise. What they discovered inside that shack would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A small boy, later identified as 4-year-old William Payne, hung suspended from a roof beam by his wrists. His small arms had been bound together, and he dangled there like a grotesque puppet, barely conscious. His skin had taken on an unhealthy bluish coloration from the cold and from impaired circulation. His small body was covered in extensive bruising, dark purple and black marks that spoke of prolonged, deliberate violence. When the men cut William down and he had recovered enough to speak, the child provided a horrifying account of what had happened to him. A boy, an older boy, had approached him with friendly words and promises. This boy had then lured William to the isolated shack, where the nightmare began. William was stripped of his clothing, rendering him vulnerable and exposed in the December cold. The older boy had tied William's small wrists together with rope, then hoisted him up to hang from the beam. And then the beating began. William described how his attacker struck him repeatedly while laughing, actually laughing at the small child's pain and terror. The older boy ran around William's suspended form in circles, striking him from different angles, clearly deriving pleasure from the child's suffering. When the older boy finally tired of his cruel game, he simply left, abandoning the 4-year-old to hang there in the freezing shack, possibly to die from exposure. This incident, horrifying as it was treated by authorities as an isolated occurrence. Perhaps it was simply too disturbing to contemplate that this might be the beginning of a pattern. Perhaps they hoped it was a single aberration, a terrible act that would not be repeated. They were tragically wrong. 2 months later, in February of 1872, another attack occurred in the same general area. 7-year-old Tracy Hayden became the next victim. Tracy was approached by a boy who lured him to the same abandoned area near Powderhorn Hill with promises and friendly conversation. But once they arrived at an isolated location, the friendly facade dropped away, revealing something monstrous beneath. Tracy was tied up, stripped naked in the winter cold, and beaten with even greater severity than William Payne had been. The assault was so vicious that Tracy suffered multiple broken teeth and a broken nose. His face was so severely battered that his features became nearly unrecognizable. Most horrifyingly, the attack nearly cost Tracy his eyesight permanently. The injuries around his eyes were so severe that doctors feared he might never see properly again. During the assault, the attacker threatened Tracy with increasingly disturbing statements, including threats to cut off his penis with a knife. The psychological trauma of these threats, combined with the physical injuries, left the young boy severely traumatized. When Tracy was finally able to provide a description of his attacker, he could only describe a boy with brown hair, not enough information to identify the perpetrator, but confirmation that the attacker was indeed a youth, not an adult. In July of 1872, the pattern continued with another victim. 6- or 7-year-old Johnny Balch was playing in his neighborhood when an older boy approached him. The boy promised Johnny money if he would come with him to a specific location. For a child from a working-class family, the promise of money was too tempting to resist. Johnny followed the older boy to Powder Horn Hill, to one of the abandoned outhouses in that desolate area. Once inside the outhouse, the nightmare began again. Johnny was suspended from a beam, his small wrists bound painfully tight. The beating that followed was thorough and methodical, covering his body with dark, painful bruises. But during this attack, the perpetrator said something particularly chilling. He told Johnny that he was acting on instructions from someone else, that someone had ordered him to do these terrible things. This claim represented an early sign of psychological dissociation, an attempt to distance himself from responsibility for his own actions. Following Johnny Balch's assault, fear spread throughout Chelsea like wildfire. Parents who had previously allowed their children to play freely now kept them close. They warned their sons and daughters never to speak to strangers, never to go anywhere with someone they didn't know, no matter what promises were made. The local newspapers published sensational accounts of the attacks, describing the perpetrator as monstrous, as something inhuman. The community demanded action from law enforcement. However, despite the growing public panic and pressure, police efforts to identify the attacker initially proved fruitless. They questioned numerous boys and young men, following false leads and mistaken identifications. Meanwhile, the real perpetrator, 12-year-old Jesse Pomeroy, continued to move freely through Chelsea, undetected and unsuspected by the very authorities seeking to stop him. Around August of 1872, Ruth Ann Pomeroy made a decision that she believed might protect her family from the growing notoriety surrounding the attacks in Chelsea. She moved with her sons from Chelsea to South Boston, settling on Broadway Street in a working-class neighborhood. Ruth Ann hoped that this geographic distance might provide a fresh start, that the troubling events in Chelsea might remain behind them. But the move to South Boston did not mark the end of Jesse's attacks. It merely transferred them to a new hunting ground. Within weeks of the family's relocation, attacks on young boys resumed, and they were growing increasingly severe in their brutality and sophistication. On August 17, 1872, 7-year-old George Pratt was discovered by local fishermen on a beach in South Boston. The boy had been subjected to a beating similar to those in Chelsea, tied up, stripped, and assaulted with shocking violence. When George recovered enough to speak, he described being lured to an isolated location by an older boy who had seemed friendly at first. Less than a month later, on September 11, another 7-year-old boy named Joseph Kennedy fell victim to the same pattern of abuse. Joseph was lured to a vacant boathouse near the South Boston salt marshes, where he was beaten and slashed with a pocket knife. The knife wounds represented an escalation in the violence. The attacker was no longer satisfied with merely beating his victims. He was now cutting them, drawing blood, inflicting wounds that would leave permanent scars. 6 days after Joseph Kennedy's assault, railway workers walking along the Hartford and Erie rail line in South Boston made a horrifying discovery. 5-year-old Robert Gould had been tied to a telegraph pole near the tracks. He had been beaten severely and slashed multiple times with a knife. But Robert Gould's assault would prove crucial to finally identifying the perpetrator, because Robert was able to provide a detail that previous victims had not mentioned clearly. Robert described his attacker's eye. One eye, he said, was very different from the other. It was cloudy, whitish, strange-looking. This distinctive feature would prove to be the key to ending Jesse Pomeroy's reign of terror. Another victim, Harry Austin, also fell prey to Jesse's attacks during this period. Each assault followed the same disturbing pattern. An older boy would approach a younger child, gain their trust through friendly conversation or promises, lure them to an isolated location, and then subject them to progressively more violent torture. With Robert Gould's description of the cloudy eye, authorities finally had a distinctive identifying feature to search for. They began a systematic search through schools in the area, examining older boys and looking for anyone who matched this unusual physical description. The net was closing in on Jesse Pomeroy, though he did not yet know it. Eventually, investigators arrived at Jesse's school and took Robert Gould and other victims through classrooms, asking them to look carefully at the older boys. When they reached Jesse Pomeroy's classroom, multiple victims immediately identified him. There was no doubt the tall boy with the distinctive clouded right eye was their attacker. Jesse was detained and subjected to prolonged, intensive questioning. The interrogation techniques of 1872 were far less regulated than modern standards would permit. Jesse, barely 12 years old, was questioned for hours without legal representation, without a parent present, and with increasing pressure and threats. The interrogators warned him that if he did not confess, he would face far worse punishment. They described in graphic detail what would happen to him if he continued to deny his involvement. Finally, exhausted and frightened, Jesse confessed to the attacks. He admitted that he was responsible for the assaults on the boys in both Chelsea and South Boston. When asked why he had done these terrible things, Jesse could provide no clear answer. He stated that he did not know why he acted as he did. He claimed that something compelled him to do it, that he felt unable to control these impulses. These explanations, or rather, this lack of explanation, would become a recurring theme throughout Jesse's case. At his trial in juvenile court, his young victims were brought before the judge to identify their attacker. One by one, they pointed to Jesse, their small fingers trembling as they identified the boy who had caused them such pain and terror. The evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable. Jesse Pomeroy, at age 12, was found guilty of multiple counts of assault and torture. On September 21, 1872, he was sentenced to serve time at the State Reform School for Boys in Westborough, Massachusetts, where he was to remain until he reached the age of 18, a sentence of approximately 6 years. In September of 1872, Jesse Pomeroy was transported to the State Reform School for Boys in Westborough, Massachusetts. This institution, despite its name suggesting rehabilitation and education, was in reality a harsh, militaristic facility that bore more resemblance to a prison than to a school. The Westborough Reform School operated on strict discipline and rigid schedules. The boys confined there were subjected to military-style drills, hard physical labor, and punishment for even minor infractions. The institution was deeply flawed in its approach, prioritizing punishment over genuine rehabilitation. The conditions were harsh, the oversight minimal, and abuse, both from guards and from older inmates, was common. Yet, despite this brutal environment, or perhaps because of it, Jesse Pomeroy's behavior within the institution proved exemplary. He followed every rule meticulously. He completed all assigned tasks without complaint. He showed deference to authority and caused no disciplinary problems whatsoever. His conduct was so consistently good that the institution's administrators began to view him as a model inmate. Jesse's intelligence served him well within the reform school. He excelled in the limited educational opportunities provided, demonstrating capabilities that impressed his instructors. He learned quickly, retained information effectively, and showed none of the violent impulses that had led to his incarceration. To all outward appearances, Jesse Pomeroy was being successfully reformed. So impressed were the reform school authorities with Jesse's transformation that they eventually promoted him to a supervisory position over other boys. Jesse was given responsibility and authority within the institution, trusted to help maintain order and discipline among his fellow inmates. He performed these duties without incident, further reinforcing the perception that he had been successfully rehabilitated. After serving 16 months of his 6-year sentence, barely more than a quarter of the prescribed time, Jesse Pomeroy was granted parole. In February of 1874, at age 14, he was released back into the custody of his mother, Ruth Ann, in South Boston. The public was not informed of his release. No warnings were issued to the community. No special supervision was arranged beyond his mother's oversight. The authorities at Westboro believed that Jesse had been reformed, that whatever darkness had driven him to torture young boys had been successfully addressed through discipline and structure. They believed they were releasing a rehabilitated youth who would return to society as a productive citizen. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Jesse returned to his mother's home and began working in her small dressmaking shop, which was located at 327 Broadway Street in South Boston. His older brother, Charles, also worked from the premises, selling newspapers. To their neighbors, the Pomeroys appeared to be a hard-working family trying to make an honest living. No one suspected that they were living and working alongside one of the most dangerous individuals in Boston's history. Jesse Pomeroy had been free for barely more than a month when the violence resumed. But this time, the attacks would not stop at torture. This time, Jesse would cross a line from which there could be no return. On March 18, 1874, a 10-year-old girl named Catherine Mary Curran, known to her family and friends as Katie, left her home to purchase school supplies. Katie needed to buy notebooks and other items for her schoolwork, and her parents gave her permission to go to the local shops. One of the stores she intended to visit was the Pomeroy family's dressmaking shop on Broadway Street, where items including school supplies were sometimes available. Katie entered the Pomeroy shop that day, and she was never seen alive again. Her parents became frantic when she failed to return home. John Curran, Katie's father, immediately reported her disappearance to the police. Extensive searches were conducted throughout South Boston. Neighbors joined in looking for the missing girl. Posters were distributed with Katie's description. But despite these efforts, no trace of Katie Curran could be found. Weeks passed with no answers. The Curran family lived in anguished uncertainty, not knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead, whether she might return or was lost to them forever. The community rallied around the grieving family, but no one could provide the answers they desperately sought. Then, on April 22, 1874, just over a month after Katie's disappearance, a horrifying discovery was made near the Dorchester Bay Marsh. The mutilated body of a small child was found in an area of marshland. The victim was 4-year-old Horace Millen. The condition of Horace's body was so disturbing that even experienced police officers and physicians were shocked. The child had been subjected to extreme violence. His throat had been slashed so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. His small body bore numerous stab wounds, 18 distinct wounds in total. His eyes had been punctured. The level of violence inflicted on this 4-year-old child exceeded anything the Boston authorities had encountered in their careers. Immediately, despite the lack of direct evidence initially connecting him to the crime, police investigators thought of Jesse Pomeroy. They remembered his past attacks on young boys. They knew he had been recently released from reform school, and they knew that his pattern had been escalating, each attack more severe than the last. It seemed logical, even inevitable, that Jesse might have progressed from torture to murder. Detectives sought out Jesse and brought him in for questioning. At first, Jesse denied any involvement in Horace Millen's murder. He claimed he knew nothing about it, that he had been nowhere near the marsh that day. But witnesses began to come forward. A man reported seeing a tall boy with distinctive features walking toward the marsh with a small child matching Horace's description. The timeline fit. The description matched Jesse. Police then took the extraordinary step of bringing Jesse to view Horace Millen's body. They led the 14-year-old boy to where the small child's corpse lay and asked him directly if he had committed this murder. Jesse's composure began to crack. Faced with the physical reality of what had been done to this 4-year-old child, Jesse eventually broke down. Jesse confessed to murdering Horace Millen. However, his confession was fragmented and disturbing in its emotional disconnect. He admitted to the killing but seemed unable or unwilling to fully acknowledge responsibility. He repeated phrases like, "I couldn't help it," and "something made me do it," as if he were describing actions taken by someone else or by forces beyond his control. One of the most chilling moments during Jesse's confession came when he begged the authorities not to tell his mother what he had done. Despite having just admitted to the brutal murder of a 4-year-old child, Jesse's primary concern seemed to be his mother's reaction and disappointment. But the horrors were not yet fully revealed. In July of 1874, several months after Jesse's arrest for Horace Millen's murder, a new tenant purchased the building at 327 Broadway Street, which included the basement space beneath the former Pomeroy dressmaking shop. The new owner, James Nash, hired workmen to begin excavations and remodeling of the basement. On July 18, 1874, two workers, Charles McGinnis and Patrick O'Connell, were excavating the basement when they noticed a strong, sickening odor. As they dug deeper, they made a gruesome discovery. Buried under a pile of ashes in a corner of the basement lay the decomposed body of Keetley, the 10-year-old girl who had disappeared more than 4 months earlier. Keetley's body showed signs of brutal violence. Her throat had been slashed, she had been stabbed multiple times. Her body had then been hastily concealed in the basement, carelessly buried under ashes in a shallow, inadequate grave. She had been there the entire time, decomposing in the darkness, while life continued in the shop above, and while her family desperately searched for any sign of her. When confronted with the discovery of Keetley Curran's body, Jesse initially denied any knowledge of her death. But the evidence was overwhelming. Keetley had last been seen entering the Pomeroy shop. Her body was found in the basement of that very shop, and Jesse had been present at the shop on the day of her disappearance. Under continued questioning, Jesse eventually admitted to killing Keetley as well, though his confession regarding her death remained vague and inconsistent. Jesse Pomeroy, at 14 years old, now stood accused of murdering 2 children, 4-year-old Horace Millen and 10-year-old Keetley Curran. The city of Boston was shocked, horrified, and outraged. How could someone so young be capable of such monstrous acts? What had created this boy fiend, as the newspapers now called him? The trial of Jesse Harding Pomeroy began on December 9, 1874, in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in Suffolk County, Boston. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Spectators lined the walls, stood in the aisles, and crowded outside the building, all desperate to catch a glimpse of the boy who had committed such heinous crimes. The case had captured not just local but national attention. Newspapers from Vermont to South Carolina covered the proceedings on their front pages. Despite the sensational nature of the case and the intense public interest, the trial itself was surprisingly brief and straightforward. The facts were not in dispute. The evidence against Jesse was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses placed him with Horace Millen on the day of the murder. His own confessions, while qualified and conditional, essentially admitted his guilt. The physical evidence was damning. Jesse's defense attorney, Charles Robinson, faced an impossible task. He was not attempting to prove Jesse's innocence. That would have been futile. Instead, Robinson's goal was more modest, but perhaps more important. He sought to save Jesse from the hangman's noose. His entire strategy centered on one argument, that Jesse Pomeroy was legally insane. Robinson presented an insanity defense that drew upon the medical and psychological understanding of the era. He argued that Jesse suffered from what was then termed moral insanity, a condition in which an individual knew the difference between right and wrong intellectually, but was compelled by irresistible impulses to commit acts they could not control. Robinson portrayed Jesse as a victim of forces beyond his comprehension or control, driven by demons he could neither understand nor resist. The defense called expert witnesses to testify about Jesse's mental state. These physicians and psychiatrists examined Jesse and offered their professional opinions about his sanity. Some supported the insanity defense, arguing that no sane person, especially a child, could commit such acts without being driven by mental disease. They pointed to Jesse's inability to explain his motivations, his claims that something made him do it, as evidence of psychological compulsion rather than rational choice. However, the prosecution presented equally credible expert witnesses who reached different conclusions. These experts testified that Jesse demonstrated clear awareness of his actions, that he had planned his attacks carefully, that he had taken steps to avoid detection, and that he had attempted to conceal his crimes. All of these factors, they argued, demonstrated that Jesse knew what he was doing was wrong and took conscious steps to avoid consequences, the very definition of legal sanity. The prosecution, led by Attorney General for Massachusetts, painted a picture of Jesse as a calculating, cruel individual who derived pleasure from causing pain and suffering. They detailed the progression of his crimes, from torturing animals to torturing children to ultimately committing murder. They argued that this progression demonstrated not insanity, but rather an evolving and increasingly dangerous criminal who would continue to escalate if given any opportunity. In his closing arguments, the prosecutor urged the jury to consider an alternative charge: murder, with extreme atrocity and cruelty. According to Massachusetts law, this charge constituted first-degree murder, but differed from premeditated murder in certain technical respects. The prosecutor wanted to ensure that the jury had multiple pathways to finding Jesse guilty of first-degree murder. After both sides had presented their cases and closing arguments had been delivered, the jury retired to deliberate Jesse Pomeroy's fate. For 5 hours, these 12 men wrestled with questions that challenged their understanding of justice, childhood, mental illness, and moral responsibility. They broke once during their deliberations. At 14, Jesse Harding Pomeroy faced trial for 2 killings. The proceedings, held in December 1874, drew intense public attention. The defense argued moral insanity, a concept suggesting that Jesse understood right from wrong but was unable to control his impulses. Expert witnesses disagreed sharply. The prosecution emphasized the progression of behavior, planning, and awareness demonstrated over time. After hours of deliberation, the jury found Jesse guilty. Due to his age, the death sentence was commuted. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement. Jesse spent decades in isolation. He read extensively, learned multiple languages, and had minimal contact with others. After his mother's death, he received no visitors. In 1929, he was transferred to a medical facility. Observers noted his detachment from the modern world. Jesse Harding Pomeroy died 2 years later. His remains were cremated per his request. Today, his case remains a subject of study. It stands as a reminder of the limits of understanding, the failures of systems, and the enduring questions surrounding responsibility and human behavior.